Hello, eighth grade. Welcome to Monday, our first day of online learning. There's a couple things I want to go over in your classroom that are different from what you are normally seeing. I'll bring up the algebra classroom, but it's the same for both. So I usually would post things in the stream, but because I'm going to be posting a lot more now with online learning, I've decided to use the classwork function because I can organize it by chapter. So at the top of the classwork function, I have this online learning information folder. Here you find the online learning plan that the junior high teachers came up with and sent out with all of the policies on junior high learning. The Pearson online textbook, in case some of you don't have your book, which you should, but if you don't, you can get to the online textbook here. There's also some online activities that eventually I may assign to you, so that's where you can access those. And I gave you an example of how you're going to log on. So you're just going to use your username from school, which for most of you is going to be your first initial dot your last name at htsavon.org. And then the password for everyone is HTS12345. There was a little online video that I put together that I hope you watched. It was like 4 minutes long. It talked about the setup on Classroom, and it also talked about the daily task planner that we created and put onto the classwork homework board. And then here's a link to my office hours. So every Tuesday and Thursday, I will be available from 11 to 11:30 to answer questions face to face. So if you have something you want to talk to me about or something you're not understanding, that's the time we can do that. And you just click on that to take you to the meeting. All right, let's start by doing a quick review. I haven't seen you guys in like a week and a half, and we never did the open note quiz for section 8.1. So that's what we're going to do tonight for homework. You're going to do the 8.1 open note quiz. I've put all of the images from our book. It was a 6-page section, all the highlighting, the activities we did, the annotations we did. So you now have a copy of what your book should look like. And so fix yours if you need to fix it. And I did put together a little Google slideshow that will just review the concepts that we covered in 8.1. I'm going to post this on our classroom as well. So all of this will be out there for you to use when you're taking your online quiz. All right, let's get started just reviewing what we'll be talking about in section 8.1. So we started talking about heredity in this chapter, and we started talking about Gregor Mendel, who was I think he was a monk, and he started noticing different things about the plants that he was growing in his monastery, and he decided to run some experiments to try to determine what caused the differences in plants. He is credited as being the father of genetics, and genetics is just the scientific study of heredity. So he is the one that kind of took the concept of heredity and started to study it and say, oh, there's ways that we can predict how things are going to happen when you cross two individuals. All right. So heredity is just the passing of physical characteristics from parents to offspring. And when we're talking heredity, we are talking about traits, and traits are each of the specific characteristics that an organism has, such as plant height or seed color when you're talking about plants. When you're talking about humans, this is anything from eye color, hair color, height, body type. All of that are different traits that we have. All right, he did some experiments. He primarily did his experiments with pea plants, and we talked in the class about the different parts of the pea plant that are needed to create new pea plants. So the pistil is the female portion of the equation. The stamen produces pollen, which is the male portion of the equation. And when the two, the egg and the sperm join, you have fertilization, and a new organism begins to form. In plants, the process of the pollen reaching the pistil, the fertilization, is called pollination. Pea plants typically self-pollinate, which means that pollen from a flower lands on the pistil of the same flower. And as we talked about in class, Mendel developed a method of cross-pollination. So with cross-pollination, so see, here's our self-pollination example. And you have the pistil here, and you have the stamen with the pollen, and through some means, typically involving animals or perhaps the wind, the pollen reaches the pistil of the same flower, and self-fertilization happens. Well, Mendel came over and said, I want to cross-pollinate, I want to control the pollination, so he cut off the stamen on this plant, and then he took the pollen from a different type of plant. So here we have a purebred purple plant, and here we have a purebred white plant, and he takes the pollen from the purebred white plant and pollinates the purple plant, and he wanted to see what happened. And remember, when we're talking about crossbreeding, purebred is just an organism that comes from a long line of organisms that have the exact same trait. Okay, so these purple plants that are purebred purple come from a long line of purple plants. This purebred white comes from a long line of white plants. When we crossbreed a purebred with a purebred, remember, we call this the P generation or the parental generation. And so we have only genes for purple plants here and only genes for white plants here. And when we cross those two, that cross is called the parental generation. All right, the resulting generation from crossing the two purebred generations is the F1 generation, or the filial generation. And what Mendel found, as we noted over here, so here I have my purebred tall, here I have my purebred short, and so the only genes the tall plant has is tall, tall, and the only genes the short plant has is short, short. And when we cross these two, he found that he only got tall plants. So here we have the purebred tall plus the purebred short. That's going to give us the F1 generation. And we see that they are all tall. And then he let these plants in the F1 generation self-pollinate. Now he also could have crossed them because at the end of the day they have the exact same gene. So whether they self-pollinate or cross-pollinate, you're going to end up with the same result. And that produced the F2 generation. And the surprise he found when he was doing this research was that in the F2 generation, that short gene, which seemed to disappear in the F1 generation, comes back. And it comes back roughly 25% of the time. All right, so Mendel reached several important conclusions with his work. Number one, he said the inheritance of traits are controlled by individual, he called them factors. We now know them to be genes. These factors or genes exist as pairs. One factor or one gene comes from the mom. One factor or one gene comes from the dad. And then he also understood or came to the realization that one factor or gene in a pair could mask the other factor or gene. All right, so what does this mean in terms of how we think about genetics? So remember, a trait is a feature or a characteristic that is inherited. A gene is a portion of the DNA that determines a trait. And each trait is determined by a pair of genes. So there's a portion of DNA from the mom and a portion of DNA from the dad, and that portion codes, to use a term that you can think of in terms of computer, codes for a certain characteristic, a certain trait to be shown. Okay? The allele is going to be what are my different options for that gene. So like we talked about in class with eye color, your different alleles are going to be blue or brown or green or hazel. So the different alleles have to do with what are my different options, what are my different outcomes for a gene. An organism's traits are controlled by which alleles or which options it inherits from each parent. So if I have a dominant allele is always going to show up in the organism whenever it's present, no matter what the other gene from the other parent is, that dominant allele is going to be expressed. The recessive allele, on the other hand, is only going to show up if it's paired with another recessive allele. If a recessive allele is paired with a dominant allele, the dominant allele is going to overshadow the recessive allele. Just like, so in the case of the plants we just talked about, the dominant allele was obviously tall, the recessive allele was short. All right, and a hybrid is an organism that has two different alleles for a trait. So the plants, if I go back here, the plants here, like we said, all have one gene that's tall from this plant and one gene that's short from this plant. So the genes for these plants are all tall, short. These are all hybrids. These are all hybrids. All right. And the significance of Mendel's work. So before Mendel, most people thought that traits were simply a blend of an individual's parents' characteristics. Now he showed rather that these traits are determined by individual alleles or individual genes that are inherited from each parent, and that certain alleles will dominate over other alleles, and that is what causes a trait to show up or not to show up in an individual. All right, I know that was quick. So use your book. You can use this Google slide presentation. Make sure you've listened to my lecture, and then you, for homework, are to go on and do the 8.1 open note quiz. All right, hope you guys have a good day/night, and I will see you tomorrow.